Hey, I want to talk with you today about suffering because sometimes in this life you will suffer. Things won't go so well. You'll feel some pain, and sometimes that suffering will come directly because you are following Jesus. Because either this world has thrown something on you because you're a Jesus follower, or you're feeling the pressure of this world to conform to things, and you're needing to say no and step away and step around and kind of find a new way or your own way to answer some problems, to navigate some scenarios, to do things different from the people around you. And you can feel that pressure. Peter talks about that. We've been walking through the book of First Peter as a church, and some others have been following along with us. I've been happy to walk with you. My name is Pastor Matt, and we're in First Peter chapter 4, the end of the chapter today. And Peter talks a lot very directly about suffering. He's been talking about suffering throughout and referencing it because it's something that's coming for this group of believers that he's writing to. And so he addresses that. And here's something that I thought of as I was reading this. You know, Jesus invites us to take up our cross and follow him. And I've said before that sometimes I wonder if we hear that, take up your cross and follow, and we think we get to choose our cross, which really understands the passage incorrectly. In other words, if I think I get to choose how I suffer for Jesus, then that's probably not how it works. I don't get to choose how I suffer. I don't get to impose suffering on myself and say, I'm suffering for Jesus. We can read about that sort of thing and the mistakes that were made, especially around the time of the Reformation. Martin Luther would write about what some of the monks and some of the monastic orders had done in taking this idea of hurting yourself, even to the point at that time of walking around barely clothed or whipping themselves with straps as a way of suffering for Christ. And that's not what suffering as a Christian is. Suffering as a Christian is going through life and saying yes to the things that God calls us to and no to some of the things that this world calls us to, and realizing that by doing so, our life becomes more difficult. Sometimes in really direct ways, we experience suffering, and sometimes in more indirect ways. And Peter addresses that. And he says, rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings. And he points us again in this book, just again and again and again, to the fact that Christ has suffered for us. And if we suffer at all, we have a model in him and we understand what he's done for us. And now he says we share in his suffering. So if we suffer for his name, we take a share in that, and we recognize that we're in this with him and he's in this with us. But he also points out if you suffer for the wrong things, that's nothing it's nothing to be proud of. It's nothing to hold on to. What is it? Verse 15. Let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. It doesn't matter if you're suffering because you're a murderer or just because you were messing around in the wrong places. That kind of suffering is wrong, okay? Yet, and I love this, verse 16, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed. In chapter 2, we talked about this idea of shame and honor, and how the honor that God gives us when he calls us a chosen people, when he calls us a holy priesthood, that is the remedy. That's the answer for shame. And Peter kind of points at that again. Do not be ashamed if you suffer for being a Christian. Do not be ashamed if your life looks like it's harder than someone else's. Do not be ashamed if you go without some things that your neighbors seem to celebrate. Do not be ashamed if you suffer for following Christ, if your life is harder because you follow Jesus. Instead, know that you are honored by your God, that he calls you his child, that Christ has suffered for you, and that these sufferings are only temporary. And if you need a reminder that these things are temporary, look at Jesus' suffering and then look to the empty tomb. Look to the resurrection, because your suffering only lasts until your resurrection, until that new life fully comes to you in the return of Jesus, in the day that you see him again. This is a small space of time. We have an eternity to celebrate with our Lord. So do not be ashamed if you suffer for the name of Christ, but take comfort and rejoice in the fact that he has suffered for you, and that if you suffer at all, he is in this with you. the one who has suffered and the one who has risen to new life, where there's zero suffering, no more tears, no more crying, no more sadness, no more shame, and no more suffering. Your God has a plan for you. He has a plan for you in Jesus. This is 1 Peter chapter 4. I look forward to jumping into the final chapter of this book with you as we continue our walk through 1 Peter.